But love is not reasonable, nor is it kind. It does not bow to the rules of men. It grows where it should not, flourishes in the cracks of oppression, and before long, he was drowning in it. In her laughter, in the way she spoke about wanting to see the world beyond the confines of the town that had shaped her, in the way she said his name like it meant something. And when she kissed him for the first time, soft and trembling beneath the oak tree where no eyes could see, he knew he was lost. Yet the world does not allow such things to exist without consequence. Nathaniel knew that every time he met Evelyn, he was risking everything, his life, his mother's tears, the future that could have been his if only he had followed the rules carved into his skin from birth. But still, he went to her. The pull between them was stronger than reason, stronger than fear, stronger than the whispers of ghosts, who had met their end for the same crime of loving where they had no right to love. They met beneath the old oak tree, where the roots tangled like the forbidden threads of their fate, where the moonlight painted silver shadows on her pale skin and his dark hands trembled as they cupped her face. "Nathaniel, I'm scared," she whispered one night, her fingers gripping his shirt, her breath warm against his collarbone. "Then don't come," he said, voice thick with something between longing and desperation. But she shook her head, eyes burning with a fire he had never seen in a white woman's gaze before. "I can't stay away from you." Neither could he. Their love grew in stolen moments, his callous fingers trailing over her silk-soft wrists, her lips pressing against the rough ridges of his palms, the shuddering breaths they shared as if trying to hold onto a dream before waking. But the world was not built for dreams like theirs. One evening, when the sun bled red over the cotton fields, Evelyn's father found a note tucked inside her dresser, one she had foolishly written in a moment of carelessness. It was not explicit, not obvious, but a father knows his daughter, and Thomas Whitmore had built his fortune on control of his land, his workers, his family. That control would not slip through his fingers. Nathaniel felt the first crack in his world the moment he saw the two men waiting outside his home, their faces twisted with the certainty of men who knew they would not be punished for what they were about to do. He ran before they could speak, before they could grab him, but running only made him guilty in their eyes. His mother screamed for him to stop, but he didn't listen. He ran through the fields, through the town, past the colored church where the echoes of Sunday hymns still clung to the air, until he reached the river where he and Evelyn had once laughed under the stars. But she wasn't there. She was never going to be there again. They caught him before he could make it to the trees, the weight of their hands like chains dragging him to the ground. The first blow split his lip. The second knocked the breath from his lungs. The third sent him spiraling into darkness. When he woke, he was in a cell, the iron bars cold against his back. "Boy, you really thought you could touch what ain't yours?" The sheriff's voice was thick with amusement, the kind that curdled in Nathaniel's stomach. "She says it ain't true, that you forced yourself on her. You best start praying, son." Nathaniel felt something shatter inside him, not just from the pain, but from the betrayal, from the knowledge that Evelyn was safe in her house while he waited for the noose. But she hadn't betrayed him. Not yet. The next night, when the town was silent, she came to him. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she pressed them through the bars. "I told them it wasn't true, Nathaniel," she sobbed. "I told them I love you." The words were a knife. He had wanted to hear them so many times before, but now they only tasted like death. "It doesn't matter," he whispered. "They've already decided." She shook her head violently. No, I won't let them take you. I have money, we can run." But they both knew there was nowhere to run. Nowhere he could go where a black man with a white woman wouldn't be hunted like an animal. The sound of boots on wood made her jerk away from him. "Evelyn!" Her father's voice snapped like a whip, and she flinched. "Go home," Nathaniel pleaded, because he would rather die than see them hurt her too. She hesitated, torn between love and the reality that love meant nothing against the laws of men. Then, with one last look, she ran. The next morning, the sun rose over a town that had already made up its mind. They dragged Nathaniel from his cell, past faces he had known his whole life, faces that had once smiled at him, faces that now watched in silence. The tree they chose stood in the center of town, its roots drinking in the blood of men who had come before him. The rope itched against his throat. He did not beg. He did not cry. He only closed his eyes and thought of the river, of the way Evelyn's hands had felt in his, of a life that could have been. And then a gunshot. Screams. Chaos. Evelyn. She stood at the edge of the crowd, a pistol trembling in her grip. Her father's body crumpled at her feet. The sheriff reached for his gun, but she turned the weapon on him. "Let him go," she said, her voice unsteady but clear. "You'll have to kill me first." The silence stretched, thick with shock, thick with something shifting, something breaking. And then the impossible happened. Someone in the crowd spoke. "Let him go." Another voice. Then another. The sheriff hesitated, the weight of a town watching his every move. And in that moment, he made a choice. He cut the rope. Nathaniel fell to the ground, gasping, choking on air that suddenly tasted like freedom. Evelyn was beside him in an instant, hands on his face, on his shoulders, whispering his name like a prayer. But they both knew it wasn't over. They ran. Together. Into the woods, into the unknown, into a future that might kill them but at least was theirs. And behind them, a town stood in stunned silence, forever changed by the girl who had pulled the trigger and the boy who had refused to bow. They ran, feet pounding against the earth, branches whipping against their skin, their breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps as the world behind them erupted into chaos, shouts, orders, the thunder of boots on dirt as men gathered, as the town tried to decide whether it would let them go or hunt them down like animals. Evelyn's dress snagged on a root, tearing as she stumbled, but Nathaniel caught her before she could fall, his grip firm around her wrist as he pulled her forward, deeper into the woods, deeper into the unknown. His lungs burned, his throat raw from where the rope had nearly stolen his life, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when freedom was close enough to taste, close enough to hope for, close enough to make him wonder if the world had finally shifted, if maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The river came into view, dark and rushing, swollen from recent rains, a barrier and a promise all at once. "We have to cross," Nathaniel said, turning to her, watching the moonlight catch in her wild, terrified eyes. She nodded, fear and resolve warring on her face, and without hesitation, they plunged into the water, the cold shocking the breath from their lungs, the current fighting to drag them down, to sweep them away, to end what the noose could not. He held on to her, arms strong around her waist as they fought their way across, their bodies slipping beneath the surface more than once, but still they pushed forward, until at last, gasping, shaking, drenched to the bone, they dragged themselves onto the far bank, collapsing in the grass, staring up at the sky, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on them, the weight of survival, of love, of defiance. "They won't stop looking for us," Evelyn whispered, her fingers clutching his, as if afraid he would vanish if she let go. "Then we don't stop running," Nathaniel murmured, pressing her hand to his lips, a silent vow, a promise forged in desperation and devotion. The night stretched around them, the sounds of the town fading behind the roar of the river, behind the rustling leaves and the distant cry of an owl. They had escaped, but they were far from safe. They had no food, no shelter, no plan beyond the desperate need to disappear, to find a place where the color of his skin and the whiteness of hers would not be a death sentence. "There's a man," Nathaniel said after a moment, his mind racing through the stories he'd heard whispered in the quarters, in the dark corners of the fields where no white men listened. "A conductor on the railroad." Evelyn frowned, breath still shaky. "A train?" He shook his head. "Not that kind of railroad. The kind that helps people like me." Like them. Her eyes widened, understanding dawning, hope flickering to life in the depths of her exhaustion. "Do you know where?" "South," he said. "But we'll have to be careful. Towns will be looking for us." She nodded, gripping his hand tighter, and together they rose, their bodies aching, their clothes soaked, but their hearts still beating, still refusing to surrender. They moved through the woods, staying close to the shadows, listening for the sounds of pursuit, but for now, the world was silent, holding its breath, waiting to see if they would make it. Days passed in a blur of hunger, exhaustion, stolen moments of rest beneath the cover of trees, drinking from streams, avoiding roads, relying on the kindness of strangers who left scraps of food outside their back doors, on the whispers of those who recognized their desperation but asked no questions. Every night, Nathaniel expected to wake to the sound of gunfire, to see torches cutting through the darkness, to feel the cold steel of shackles once more. But Evelyn never wavered. She was a girl raised in privilege, in comfort, in certainty, but now she was something else entirely. A fugitive, a woman willing to burn her past to the ground for a future she refused to let slip through her fingers. And he loved her for it. Loved her with a ferocity that made the hunger, the fear, the exhaustion worth enduring. When they reached the small town where the conductor was said to be, Nathaniel hesitated. This was the moment, the line between hope and betrayal, between freedom and a grave. Evelyn squeezed his hand. "We have to trust someone," she said, and he knew she was right. So they knocked. The door opened. A man stared at them, face unreadable, eyes sharp, wary. Then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. And just like that, the world shifted again. They stepped inside, their bodies stiff with exhaustion, dripping river water onto the wooden floor as the door shut behind them, sealing them in with the heavy scent of candle wax, old wood, and something cooking over a slow fire. The man who had let them in was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin dark like Nathaniel's, but lined with age and wisdom, his expression unreadable as he studied them, taking in their torn clothes, the bruises still blooming along Nathaniel's jaw, the way Evelyn's fingers trembled where they clung to his. "You came a long way," the man finally said, voice low, measured. "Too far to turn back," Nathaniel answered, not knowing if he was speaking to a friend or an enemy, not knowing if he had just walked them into salvation or their doom. The man nodded once, as if that was the right answer, as if he had been waiting for it, and then he gestured for them to follow. They moved deeper into the house, past flickering candles casting long shadows, past wooden furniture that looked worn with time, past a woman sitting at a table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes sharp as she watched them enter. "Your name?" she asked. Nathaniel hesitated, but Evelyn spoke first. "I'm Evelyn. And this is Nathaniel." The woman's gaze flickered over them again, lingering on the way Evelyn stood close to him, on the way his hand rested on her back, protective, possessive. She let out a soft breath, something like sadness crossing her face. "You're running," she said, not a question. Nathaniel gave a small nod. "We are." "They'll be looking," the man said. "A white girl with a Negro man, that's a hunt waiting to happen." Evelyn flinched at the word, but she didn't let go of Nathaniel's hand. "We just need safe passage," she said, voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing her down. "We'll do whatever it takes." The man and woman exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them, something heavy with the weight of too many people who had come through their door, with the same desperation in their eyes, the same hope flickering in their chests, like a candle in the wind. Finally, the man spoke. "Eat first," he said, nodding toward the table. "Then we talk." Nathaniel didn't need to be told twice. The moment the plate of food was placed before him, his hand shook as he lifted the spoon, as he took the first bite, as warmth flooded through his starved body. Evelyn ate beside him, slower, more careful, but no less grateful. The woman watched them the whole time, her sharp gaze softening just a little as she poured them water, as she handed Evelyn a cloth to clean the dirt from her face. When the plates were empty, the man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "The train won't take you," he said. "Too dangerous now, too many eyes. But there's another way. You head south, find the river, Follow it to the next town. There's a preacher there, name of Grayson. He'll know what to do." Nathaniel nodded, committing the name to memory, but Evelyn's brow furrowed. "How do we know we can trust him?" she asked. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't. You trust him the way you trusted us. You trust him because you don't have another choice." The truth of it sat heavy between them, thick as the night pressing against the windows. "You rest here," the man continued, "but only till dawn. Then you move." And so they did. The hours passed in a restless blur, Nathaniel half sleeping with one ear open for danger, Evelyn curled beside him on the hard floor, her fingers entwined with his even in sleep. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, they rose. The man handed Nathaniel a knife, small, hidden, something he could use if he had to. The woman gave Evelyn a bundle of food, pressing it into her hands, with a look that said she knew what it meant to love against the rules of the world. Then, without another word, they slipped back into the darkness, into the cold morning air, into the unknown. The river was waiting. The road was long. And the hunt had already begun. They walked in silence, their breath visible in the cold morning air, the ground damp beneath their feet, the sky above them stretching in endless shades of gray, as if the world itself held its breath. Nathaniel held Evelyn's hand tightly, his grip firm, steady, the only thing keeping him from drowning in the weight of everything that loomed behind them. The town they had fled, the faces twisted in hate, the voices shouting their names like a curse, the sound of boots pounding against the dirt as men gathered to hunt them down like animals. Evelyn shivered beside him, not from the cold but from the terror that had lodged itself deep within her, from the knowledge that at any moment a voice could call out from behind them, a gun could cock, the world could turn to fire and pain, and the cruel reality that love alone was never enough to keep them safe. But they kept walking, each step a defiance, each breath a prayer. The river lay ahead, dark and winding, its surface rippling under the whisper of the wind, the sound of rushing water filling the air like an omen. Nathaniel's heart pounded as he scanned the banks, searching for the path the old man had told him about, searching for any sign that they were not alone, that someone had been waiting, that the preacher existed at all, and this was not just a cruel trick played by hope. Evelyn squeezed his hand, drawing his eyes to her, and for a moment they just stood there, staring at each other, the weight of everything they had lost, everything they still had to lose, hanging between them like an unspoken truth. "We keep going," she said, voice trembling but certain, and he nodded because there was no other choice. The path was barely there, hidden beneath overgrown brush, winding through thick trees that swallowed them whole, the river always at their side, a silent companion in the dark. The hours stretched, their bodies aching, their feet raw from the miles they had traveled, but neither of them spoke of stopping, neither of them spoke of turning back. The only way was forward. The only way was survival. Then a sound. Footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Close. Nathaniel stopped, his breath catching in his throat, his grip on Evelyn tightening as she pressed against him, her fingers digging into his arm. The rustling grew louder, the snap of twigs beneath boots, the low murmur of voices carried on the wind. Men. More than one. Searching. Hunting. He pulled Evelyn behind a tree, pressing her close, his heart pounding so loudly he swore they would hear it, that the whole forest would hear it, that the world itself would betray them. The voices drew nearer, sharp, angry. "They couldn't have gone far," one said, rough and patient. "Girl's weak. She won't last." Nathaniel's jaw clenched, fury burning hot in his veins, but he forced himself still, forced himself silent. Evelyn's breath was warm against his neck, shallow, frightened, but she didn't move, didn't make a sound, didn't do anything that would make their deaths come quicker. The voices drifted, moving further down the river, swallowed by the trees. But they were still out there, still looking, still waiting. Nathaniel let out a slow breath, his hand shaking as he brushed a strand of hair from Evelyn's face, as he looked into her wide, terrified eyes. "We have to go," he whispered, and she nodded, her fingers tightening around his as they stepped out from the shadows and back into the endless stretch of road that lay ahead. They moved faster now, the fear and iron weight pressing against them, the knowledge that time was running out pushing them forward. The sun had begun to set by the time they saw it, a small church, barely standing, nestled between the trees, its wooden walls worn, its windows dark. The preacher. If he was real, if he was waiting, if they had not walked straight into another trap. Nathaniel hesitated, every muscle in his body screaming at him to turn back, to run, to fight, to do anything but knock on that door and hope a stranger would save them. But Evelyn was already moving, already reaching out, already lifting her hand to the rough wood. Before she could knock, the door opened. An old man stood there, his face lined with age, his eyes sharp, searching, knowing. He looked at them the way a man looks at ghosts, at echoes of the past that had walked through his door too many times before. And then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. They stepped inside. The door closed, and the world outside became nothing but silence. The room was dimly lit by the flickering glow of a single oil lamp, casting long shadows against the wooden walls, the air thick with the scent of old books and candle wax, the kind of place where time felt heavy, where stories lingered in the dust, where secrets were whispered into the cracks of the floorboards. Nathaniel kept Evelyn close, his heart pounding, his body tense to run, to fight, to do whatever it took if this man turned out to be someone they couldn't trust, if this shelter was just another trap, if the kindness in his voice was nothing but a lie wrapped in false salvation. The old man watched them, eyes deep-set and knowing, his fingers wrapped around a worn Bible, not with the gentle touch of a preacher, but with the grip of a man who had clung to faith like a rope tied around his throat, tightening and loosening with each passing year. "You don't have much time," he said finally, voice hoarse with age and something else, something heavier, something that tasted like regret. "They're looking. They always look. You're not the first to come through here." Evelyn swallowed hard, her fingers digging into Nathaniel's arm as she whispered, "Can you help us?" The preacher's gaze flickered between them, searching, deciding, weighing their worth against whatever burdens he carried in his own heart. "I can try," he said, and that was the most honest thing they had heard in a long time. He led them deeper into the church, past wooden pews worn down by decades of knees pressing into them in desperate prayer, past an altar stained with candle wax and time, past a door that led to a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. "This was built for the underground," he murmured, lighting another lamp, revealing the cold stone walls of a hidden cellar, a place that had once been a refuge, a sanctuary, a last chance for so many who had walked the same road they were on now. Not many left who remember. Not many left who care. The weight of history pressed down on them as they stepped inside, as the preacher placed the lamp on a wooden crate, as the shadows flickered against the walls like ghosts, whispering stories of those who had come before, those who had run, those who had been caught, those who had disappeared into the night never to be seen again. Evelyn sank onto an old cot, her body trembling with exhaustion, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. But she didn't cry, wouldn't cry, couldn't afford to cry. Nathaniel stayed standing, watching the preacher, his fists clenched, his breath shallow. "What happens now?" The old man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, the weight of his years pressing into his bones. "You rest. You eat. And when the time comes, I get you across the river." Silence settled between them, thick and unspoken, filled with things none of them had the strength to say. Nathaniel sat beside Evelyn, her fingers reaching for his, their hands tangling together like roots desperate to hold on, to anchor themselves in something real, something steady, something that hadn't yet been taken from them. Hours passed. Maybe days. Time lost meaning in the cellar, in the waiting, in the heavy hush of a world holding its breath. Then a knock. 3 sharp raps against the wood above, a signal, a warning, a moment that split time in half. The preacher stiffened, his eyes dark with something unreadable, something that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low, urgent, but Nathaniel was already rising, already moving, already ignoring the way Evelyn's grip tightened in silent protest. He followed the preacher up the stairs, his breath slow, controlled, his body coiled tight like a wire ready to snap. The door creaked open, and there they stood. 3 men. 2 in deputy uniforms, the third in a suit too fine for a man with dirty hands, a sheriff's badge gleaming against his chest like a mockery of justice. Nathaniel's pulse thundered in his ears, his fingers twitching, his mind racing through all the ways this could end, through all the roads that led to blood and fire, and the cold steel of shackles snapping shut around his wrists. The sheriff smiled, slow and easy, the kind of smile that slithered under the skin, that twisted into something rotten at the edges. "Evening, Reverend," he drawled, stepping inside like he owned the place, like he owned the air they breathed, like he had already decided how this would end. "I hear you've been keeping guests." The preacher's face didn't change, didn't betray a flicker of fear, of doubt, of anything but the weathered patience of a man who had spent too many years hiding his own sins behind Scripture. "Ain't no guests here, but the good Lord," he said, voice steady, but Nathaniel saw it, the way his fingers trembled ever so slightly against the Bible he still held, the way his breath hitched in that space between silence and something breaking. The sheriff hummed, looking around, running a hand over the wooden pews, tapping his fingers against the pulpit like he was waiting for a confession. "See, now that's interesting," he mused, his gaze flickering to Nathaniel, sharp, knowing, cruel. "Because some folks saw a couple pass through town. A man that looks a whole lot like him." He jerked his chin toward Nathaniel. "And a woman who don't belong to him." Nathaniel's jaw clenched so hard it hurt, his muscles screaming to move, to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there and let this man play God with his fate. "We got no trouble here," the preacher said, but the sheriff only smiled wider, only stepped closer, only let the weight of the noose around Nathaniel's neck grow tighter. "Well now," he said, almost gentle, almost kind, almost like he wasn't holding the power to end everything in his hands. "I guess we'll see about that." The sheriff's words hung in the air like a death sentence as the tension thickened between them, the dim light flickering over faces etched with anger and defiance, and Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that every instinct, every fiber of his being, was screaming to run, to break free of this nightmare. Yet he stood rooted to the spot as the preacher's eyes burned with an inner fire that he had never seen before, a fire fueled by years of silent suffering and the desperate need to protect those who could not protect themselves, and the sheriff's voice lowered to a sinister murmur as he stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his service weapon, his smile twisting into something that betrayed a dark satisfaction, while behind him the deputies shifted, ready to enforce a rule that had been written in blood and fear, and in that suffocating moment, Nathaniel felt a surge of memories crash over him. The harsh days of working the fields under an unforgiving sun. The nights filled with whispered warnings, and the relentless burden of a lifetime where every glance from a white man was a reminder of his supposed inferiority. Every harsh word of verdict passed before he could speak, and he recalled the promise he had made to himself and to his fallen brothers and sisters that he would not be broken by a system that measured worth by skin color, that he would fight for every scrap of dignity even if it meant standing against the very embodiment of that cruelty. And as the sheriff's words grew sharper, mocking the love that had once kindled hope in his heart, twisting the memory of Evelyn's tender smile into a cruel taunt, Nathaniel's resolve crystallized. He could no longer allow the past to dictate his future, nor could he let this moment be the end of his story, for even as his body trembled with fear and exhaustion, his soul blazed with the unyielding fire of survival. And in that heartbeat before action, the preacher stepped forward, his voice low and resonant. "We have come too far to let the darkness win." And his words were not a plea but a command that stirred the silent courage of those gathered in the hidden sanctuary, and the deputies exchanged uneasy glances as if they too felt the shifting weight of fate, and the sheriff's grip on his weapon tightened before he sneered. "You think you can defy the law with your sentimentality?" As his gaze bore into Nathaniel's eyes, challenging him to a duel of wills, and in that charged silence, Nathaniel's body moved on its own, his fists clenching and unclenching as he prepared for the inevitable clash, the room seeming to shrink, the air turning thick with anticipation, and without warning, the sound of shattering glass echoed from outside, drawing every eye toward the door, and in that instant of chaos, when the sheriff's attention faltered and the deputies hesitated, Nathaniel lunged forward with a desperate cry, his voice raw and fierce as he shouted for the truth of every injustice he had ever suffered, every time he had been reduced to nothing by a system that had always meant to break him, and the preacher's voice rose in unison with the murmurs of the gathered crowd, a chorus of voices long silenced now united in defiance, and as the confrontation erupted into a tumult of shouts, clashing bodies, and the cacophony of a fight that was both physical and symbolic, Nathaniel and the others fought not only for their freedom in that moment but for the very right to exist, to love, to remember that every bruise, every scar, every tear had been a testament to their enduring strength, and the sheriff's men, caught off guard by the surge of unexpected resistance, began to falter, their disciplined formations breaking down as fear and uncertainty replaced their practiced hostility, and amidst the chaos, Nathaniel caught a glimpse of the sheriff's eyes, cold, calculating, but now haunted by a flicker of doubt, and in that moment he knew that the battle was larger than any one man, that the tide of history was turning against a system that had long thrived on oppression, and as the struggle continued, with every punch thrown and every shout echoing against the walls of that hidden sanctuary, the preacher called out for calm and unity, urging the people to seize this moment of weakness in the enemy's resolve, to take back the dignity that had been stolen from them. And the air filled with the sounds of defiance and hope, a promise that even in the midst of violence and bloodshed, the truth could not be silenced, that every voice raised against the tyranny of a racist past was a step toward a future where the color of one's skin would no longer determine one's fate. And as the first rays of dawn began to filter through the broken windows, illuminating the scene of chaos and courage with a pale, hopeful light, Nathaniel, battered and bruised but unbowed, stood amidst the ruins of the confrontation, his chest heaving with exhausted determination, knowing that this was only the beginning, that the road ahead would be fraught with more battles and more tears, but also knowing that the fight for justice, for love, for the right to exist as a full human being, was a battle worth every scar, worth every drop of blood. And as he looked around at the faces of his fellow fighters, faces marked with sorrow and resolve, with pain and the promise of a better tomorrow, he silently vowed that he would continue, that no matter how long or hard the journey, he would never let the darkness win, because in that final, lingering moment of dawn, as the echoes of the night faded into a fragile silence, the spark of change had been lit, and it would burn until every hidden truth was brought to light, and every voice that had ever been silenced roared into the promise of a new day. The dust from the confrontation settled in the air like smoke from a fire that had yet to fully extinguish, and Nathaniel stood amidst the wreckage, his body aching, his muscles trembling, but his spirit unwavering. The sheriff, bruised and bloodied, stood in stunned silence, his gaze darting from Nathaniel to the others who were now gathering themselves, the crowd slowly but surely coming together in defiance, their faces lit not by the dim light of fear, but by the burning fire of conviction. There were still so many wounds to heal, so many battles left to fight, but for the first time, Nathaniel felt a flicker of hope stir in his chest. The preacher's voice cut through the stillness, not loud, but clear. "We've made it this far. The struggle is far from over, but this moment shows us something we've always known deep down. The fight for justice is ours to win. It will take time. It will take sacrifice. But together, we are unstoppable." Nathaniel looked out at the faces around him, each one reflecting a different emotion, exhaustion, pain, defiance, but also something new, hope. He thought of Evelyn, of the love they had fought for in secret, of the lies they had been told by a world that saw them as less than human. He thought of the sacrifices she had made, of how she had always believed in the possibility of a world where love could be free, where race no longer dictated who could live and who could die. The police cars outside, still parked with sirens now silent, seemed like distant reminders of the battle they had just fought. But Nathaniel knew they weren't gone. Not yet. But there was something else in the air now. The sheriff's retreat had only been the beginning. The tides of history had begun to shift, and they were shifting in their favor. As Nathaniel looked around, he saw his brothers and sisters, people who had suffered in silence, who had been crushed under the weight of a racist system that sought to control every aspect of their lives, now standing tall, shoulders squared, not broken, but united. In the distance, the sound of footsteps approached, more of their people, rising to join the movement, to claim what had been stolen from them, to bring the fight into the daylight. Nathaniel felt a lump rise in his throat. His body was tired, and his heart still carried the heavy burden of loss, but he knew, deep in his bones, that they had begun something unstoppable. A small part of him wondered if Evelyn would have lived to see this moment, if she would have seen the world they were now shaping, if she would have been proud of what he had done. He knew she would have. She had always believed in him, in them, in the possibility of love in a world that tried to erase it. And as the preacher gathered the people to move forward, Nathaniel caught one last glance of the sheriff, now retreating toward his car, face twisted in shame, the power he had wielded for so long slipping away from his grasp. It wasn't over. It would never be over until every life, every voice, every love could exist without fear. But for now, they had one. The people around him had made it clear that they would not stop fighting for their freedom, for the right to live without the constant weight of oppression. Nathaniel stepped forward, his eyes still burning with the rage that had propelled him to this moment, but also with a new understanding, that while the battle for justice was never truly won in a single act, it was a war of persistence, of resistance, of love that would not die, no matter how deep the cuts, how many times the chains tried to bind them. The preacher's words, once again, rang in his ears. "We are the change. We are the fire." And Nathaniel knew, then, that the fire they had started would never be snuffed out. It would burn bright, and its light would lead them all to a place where love wasn't forbidden, where race wasn't a reason to hate, where freedom wasn't just a dream, it was a right. In that moment, he felt the weight of all his ancestors, all those who had come before, all those who had given their lives for the possibility of this moment, and he promised them, with everything in him, that he would carry this fight until it was won. The sun was beginning to rise higher, the first light of the day illuminating their faces, casting shadows that stretched long behind them. And as they stood together in that fragile light, Nathaniel felt an overwhelming sense of peace, not because the world had changed in that instant, but because he knew they would change it together. They would fight for what was right, and no one, not the sheriff or the law, or any of the men and women who tried to tear them apart, could ever take that away. And as they began to walk forward, the crowd moving with purpose and unity, Nathaniel felt the power of a love that refused to die, a love that had once been whispered in secret, now rising into the open air as an act of defiance, an act of survival. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, Nathaniel understood something profound, that the love between him and Evelyn had never been just about them. It had been about the generations before, the generations to come, the fight for a future where love would no longer be seen as a crime, but as a right for every person, regardless of their color, their birth, their status. The fight for that love would not die. And as the first rays of light broke through the trees, Nathaniel stepped forward, his heart full of love, of grief, and of hope, knowing that though the world had taken so much from him, it had not taken his spirit, not taken the love he had fought for. And it would never take it. Not now. Not ever. As Nathaniel walked, the sun began to rise higher, casting long shadows across the earth. His steps were slow but determined, the weight of everything he had endured pressing against him, yet there was a new kind of lightness within him. The anger that had fueled him for so long was now tempered with a quiet strength, a recognition that the battle, though far from over, had reached a significant turning point. He thought of Evelyn, of her face in the early morning light, of the fire in her eyes when she spoke of a world where love and equality could thrive. His heart clenched with the pain of her absence, but it was not just the pain of loss. It was the realization that the love they shared, the love that had once been hidden in secret, was now the fuel for something much larger than them. He had thought that her death, her absence, would break him, would stop him from fighting, but now, in the aftermath of everything that had happened, he understood something crucial, that the love they had was immortal, that it lived on in the fight, in the voices of the people standing behind him, in the world they were striving to build. The sheriff's retreating figure, still visible in the distance, was a stark reminder that their enemies hadn't gone away. The systems of oppression that had shaped their lives were still present, lurking beneath the surface, but for the first time, Nathaniel felt a sense of control, not just over his own life, but over the future. His hands, still trembling from the adrenaline, clenched into fists at his sides. There was a world to rebuild, a society to reshape, and the work had only just begun. But he was no longer alone. The faces around him, so many of them, different ages, different backgrounds, but united by a common purpose, reminded him that this wasn't just his fight. It was theirs. Together, they were stronger than any of the forces that sought to tear them apart. As the preacher's words echoed in his ears once more, "We are the change. We are the fire." Nathaniel felt the weight of history behind him, the weight of every life that had been lost in the fight for freedom, and every life that would come after him, living in the world they were beginning to shape. His heart swelled with love for the people beside him, for their bravery, their resilience, their refusal to be silenced. And though he still carried the scars of the past, some visible, some hidden, he knew now that those scars were not marks of defeat. They were reminders of the strength it took to survive, to keep pushing forward, even when the world seemed intent on breaking you. As they moved forward, Nathaniel glanced once more at the sheriff's retreating figure, his mind heavy with the knowledge that this moment, this victory, would not be the last. The battle would continue. But it wasn't just the fight against the system that mattered now. It was the love that had once been forbidden, but was now the spark for revolution. It was the love that had never died, even in the face of so much pain, so much loss. Nathaniel knew that as long as they held on to that love, they would win. Because love, true love, had the power to change everything. The road ahead would be long. The struggles would continue. But for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel allowed himself to believe in the possibility of change, in the possibility of a world where people like him, and Evelyn, and all those who had been silenced and oppressed, could live without fear, without shame. And so, as the crowd moved forward, Nathaniel took his place at the front, his heart still aching, still grieving, but also filled with an unshakable hope. The fight for love and justice had just begun, but Nathaniel knew that no matter what happened, no matter how much time passed, he would never stop fighting for a world where love was never a crime. With that thought in his heart, he walked forward, ready for whatever came next, knowing that the love he had fought for, the love they all fought for, would never fade. Not now. Not ever. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.